The thunder cracked across the vast Montana sky as Grace Keller urged her mare forward, the heavy rain pelting her face like tiny needles. The storm had caught her halfway between her homestead and town, and now she was desperately seeking shelter in the growing darkness. Through sheets of rain, she spotted a small cabin nestled against the foothills, a faint light flickering in its window like a beacon in the storm. Without hesitation, she directed her exhausted horse toward it, hoping whoever lived there would offer refuge until the weather cleared. Montana Territory, 1878, was unforgiving to those who traveled alone, especially women. At 26, Grace had learned to face the harsh realities of frontier life. 3 years after losing her parents to influenza, she maintained their modest ranch with stubborn determination, refusing offers to sell despite the challenges of running it alone. As she approached the cabin, Grace noticed a corral with a few horses huddled under a lean-to. A good sign the owner was home. She dismounted, her sodden skirts heavy around her ankles, and led her mare to the modest porch. After securing the reins to a post, she knocked firmly on the weathered door, pulling her drenched shawl tighter around her shoulders. No answer came. She knocked again, louder this time, the wind howling around the eaves of the cabin. "Hello," she called out. "Is anyone there? I need shelter from the storm." Still nothing. The door wasn't locked, unusual for these parts where even honest folk secured their homes. Hesitantly, she pushed it open, peering into the dimly lit interior. "Hello? I mean no harm. The storm caught me." Her voice trailed off as her eyes adjusted to the light. A man knelt on the floor in the center of the room, his broad shoulders hunched and shaking. Before him lay a woman's dress, faded blue calico spread across the rough wooden planks. He was so absorbed in his grief that he hadn't heard her knocks or calls. Grace froze, feeling like an intruder in this private moment of sorrow. She knew she should step back outside, but the crack of thunder made her jump, inadvertently pushing the door wider with a loud creak. The man's head snapped up, and he rose to his feet in one fluid motion, his hand instinctively moving to where a gun would normally be holstered. His face, partially illuminated by the lantern's glow, revealed tear-streaked cheeks beneath a week's worth of stubble. "Who are you?" His voice was hoarse, either from disuse or crying. "I'm sorry," Grace said quickly, taking a small step back.
"I'm Grace Keller."
"My ranch is about 10 miles east. The storm. I was just looking for shelter. I knocked, but you didn't answer." The man stared at her for a long moment, as if processing her words through a fog. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with dark hair that curled slightly where it touched his collar. His clothes were dusty, but of good quality, a black vest over a once white shirt, dark trousers tucked into worn boots. A cowboy, but not a common ranch hand. "I should go," Grace said, uncomfortable under his intense scrutiny.
"No."
The words seemed to surprise him as much as her. He cleared his throat. "No, you can't ride in this. The creek might be flooding already." He hastily bent down and gathered the dress from the floor, folding it with careful hands before placing it in a trunk by the wall. "Thank you," Grace said, still hesitating at the threshold. "I don't want to intrude." "You're not." He wiped his face quickly with his sleeve. "Name's Garrett Sullivan. This is my place." He gestured vaguely at the sparse cabin, a table with 2 chairs, a stove in the corner, a bed against a far wall, and the trunk where he'd just placed the dress. It was clean but Spartan, a man's living quarters with little ornamentation. "Your horse needs shelter too," Garrett said, suddenly businesslike. "Let me take it to the barn." He grabbed a slicker from a hook by the door and brushed past her, out into the downpour. Alone in his cabin, Grace felt uncomfortable but grateful to be out of the rain. She removed her drenched shawl and hung it on a hook, unsure what to do next. Her eyes were drawn to the trunk where he'd placed the dress, but she resisted the urge to look inside. Whatever memories it contained were clearly painful and private. Garrett returned minutes later, soaked despite the slicker. "Your mare's settled with some hay. Storm's getting worse." He removed his dripping coat and hat, hanging them by the door, then moved to stoke the fire in the stove. "You should get dry. I don't have women's clothes, but—" He hesitated, glancing at the trunk, then shook his head. "I can lend you a shirt and trousers. They'll be big, but dry." "That's very kind," Grace said, shivering slightly as the warmth of the room made her more aware of her wet clothes. "I'm sorry to put you out like this." "You're not." His words were clipped, efficient. He retrieved clothes from a small chest and handed them to her. "You can change behind that curtain." He nodded toward a corner of the cabin that had been partitioned off with a faded curtain. The shirt and trousers enveloped her, but they were blissfully dry. She rolled the sleeves and pant legs, cinching the waist with her belt. When she emerged, Garrett had his back to her, preparing coffee on the stove. "Feel better?" he asked without turning. "Yes, thank you." She approached the stove, drawn by its warmth. "I truly appreciate your hospitality." He nodded, still not meeting her eyes. "Coffee will be ready soon. Afraid I don't have much food. Wasn't expecting company." "The coffee is more than enough," she assured him. The silence stretched between them, punctuated by the rain pounding on the roof and the occasional rumble of thunder. When he finally handed her a steaming mug, their fingers brushed, and his eyes met hers for the first time since she discovered him with the dress. They were deep blue, rimmed with red, filled with a grief so profound it made her breath catch. "I'm sorry," she said softly, "about whatever you're going through." Garrett moved away, taking his coffee to one of the chairs at the table. "You found me at a weak moment."
His jaw tightened.
"The dress. It was my wife's. Rebecca. She died 3 years ago today." Grace sat in the other chair, careful to give him space. "I lost my parents 3 years ago. The pain changes, but it doesn't really go away, does it?" He looked up, surprised by her understanding. "No, it doesn't." He stared into his coffee. "I thought I'd forgotten how to cry for her. Thought I'd gone numb." A bitter laugh escaped him. "Turns out I was wrong." "Sometimes remembering is all we can do," Grace offered quietly. Rebecca would say the same thing. For the first time, a ghost of a smile touched his lips. She believed memories kept people alive in our hearts. Thunder boomed directly overhead, making the windows rattle. "You'll have to stay the night," Garrett said. "All business again. Creek will be impassable until morning." He nodded toward the bed. "You take it. I'll use my bedroll by the fire." "I couldn't possibly, I insist," he said firmly. "Rebecca would haunt me if I made a lady sleep on the floor." Grace studied him as he moved around the cabin, setting up his bedroll. There was a gentleness to his movements that belied his rugged exterior. This was a man who had loved deeply and lost profoundly. As the night wore on, they talked. It started with practical things, where their ranches were located, the challenges of the harsh Montana winters, the price of cattle. But as the storm raged outside, their conversation deepened. "What was she like?" Grace finally asked. "Rebecca?" Garrett was quiet so long she thought he wouldn't answer. "Then, she was sunshine. Laughed more than anyone I ever met. Could charm the birds from the trees." His fingers traced the grain of the wooden table.
"We met in Missouri."
"I was working cattle drives. She was a shopkeeper's daughter. Followed me out here because I had dreams of my own spread." "And you built this place for her," Grace said, understanding now why the small cabin had touches that spoke of a woman's hand. The curtain, a small vase on the windowsill, a quilt folded neatly at the foot of the bed. "We were going to expand it, have children." He looked around the cabin. She wondered about this solitary cowboy with the wounded heart, and why fate had brought her to his door on this of all nights. Morning brought clear skies and birdsong. Grace woke to find Garrett already outside, tending to the animals. Her clothes had dried overnight, so she changed back into them, folding his borrowed garments neatly on the bed. When he returned, he seemed different, more composed, the mask of stoicism firmly back in place. "Creek's down enough to cross," he told her. "I'll ride with you to make sure you get home safe." "You don't have to do that," she protested. "I know." For the first time, he looked directly at her without pain shadowing his eyes. "I want to." They rode side by side through the fresh, washed morning, the mountains crisp against the blue sky. Garrett pointed out landmarks, his deep voice carrying easily in the clear air. By the time they reached Grace's homestead, a modest house with a barn and small corral, they had exchanged stories of their lives that neither had shared with anyone in years. Grace's ranch hand, an older man named Hank who lived in the bunkhouse and helped with the heavier work, watched curiously as Garrett helped Grace dismount. "Thank you," she said, suddenly shy. "For everything." He nodded, his hat brim low over his eyes. "Least I could do." He hesitated, then added, "If you need anything, you know where to find me." Grace watched him ride away, a strange emptiness settling in her chest. She had only known Garrett Sullivan for less than a day, yet somehow he had carved a space in her thoughts. 2 weeks passed before she saw him again. She was in town, picking up supplies at Henderson's general store, when a familiar figure entered. Garrett stopped short when he saw her, surprise evident on his face before he collected himself and tipped his hat. "Miss Keller." "Mr. Sullivan. Good to see you again." Their conversation was stilted, formal, nothing like the intimate confidences they had shared during the storm. Yet as they both finished their shopping, he offered to help load her wagon. "I've been meaning to thank you properly," Grace said as they stood beside her wagon. Would you like to come for dinner sometime? As repayment for your hospitality." A flicker of something interest? Fear? Crossed his face. "That's not necessary." "I know it's not necessary," she said, gathering her courage. "But I'd like it if you came." After a long moment, he nodded. "Sunday?" Sunday would be perfect. That dinner led to another, and soon Garrett was riding over every Sunday. They established a comfortable routine. He would arrive mid-afternoon, help with whatever ranch work needed doing, then join Grace for a meal that became increasingly elaborate as she took pride in cooking for someone besides herself. Spring bloomed across the prairie, painting it with wildflowers. Their friendship deepened, though neither acknowledged the growing tension between them. Garrett remained reserved, as if keeping part of himself locked away, but Grace began to see glimpses of the man he must have been before loss hardened him. One Sunday in late April, Grace asked him to stay for supper after they had spent the afternoon repairing her corral. The work had been companionable, their bodies finding a natural rhythm as they labored side by side. Grace found herself watching his hands, strong, capable hands that handled tools with the same gentle precision she remembered him using to fold Rebecca's dress. They ate on the porch, enjoying the mild evening. When Grace brought out apple pie for dessert, Garrett's eyes lit up. "Rebecca used to make apple pie," he said, then immediately looked away, as if he'd broken some unspoken rule by mentioning her. Grace set the pie down between them.
"Tell me about it."
"Her pie." He looked up, surprised. "You don't mind me talking about her?" "Of course not." Grace cut a generous slice for him. "She was your wife. She's part of who you are." Something released in Garrett then, a tension he'd been carrying since they'd begun spending time together. He spoke more freely about Rebecca after that, sharing stories that made them both laugh. In turn, Grace opened up about her own dreams, the ones she'd set aside when responsibility for the ranch fell to her. "I always wanted to teach," she confessed one evening as they watched the sunset from her porch. "There's talk of building a proper school in town next year." "You'd be good at it," Garrett said with certainty. "You have patience."
Doi.
She laughed. "Not according to Hank. He says I'm the most stubborn woman in the territory." "That too," Garrett conceded with a rare smile. But the best teachers are stubborn. They don't give up on people. Their eyes met, and Grace wondered if he was thinking that she hadn't given up on him, on the possibility that he might find happiness again. Summer brought its own rhythm to ranch life. Garrett began staying later on Sundays, sometimes not riding home until the stars were thick in the sky. Occasionally, he'd appear midweek with some excuse he was passing by. He had extra vegetables from his garden. He wanted to check on the roof repair they'd done. Grace never questioned these visits. She welcomed them and him with a warmth that was beginning to feel like more than friendship. On a sweltering July afternoon, Garrett arrived with his wagon rather than on horseback. In the back was a rocking chair, beautifully crafted of dark wood with intricate carving on the back slats. "Made it myself," he said gruffly when she admired it. "Thought your porch needed one." Grace ran her fingers over the smooth wood, speechless at the hours of work represented in the gift. "It's beautiful," she finally managed. "But why?" "Saw how you like to sit out evenings." He shrugged, uncomfortable with her gratitude. "Thought you should be comfortable." It was the first gift he'd given her, and the most personal gesture he'd made. That night, they sat together on the porch until long after darkness fell. Grace in her new rocking chair, Garrett on the porch steps, talking softly about everything and nothing. As summer waned, a new tenseness developed between them, not unpleasant, but charged with unspoken feelings. Grace found herself watching the trail from town on Sundays, her heart quickening at the first sight of him riding toward her homestead. Garrett, for his part, began to find excuses to touch her a hand at the small of her back as they entered the house, fingers brushing as he passed her tools, standing close enough that their shoulders touched as they looked out over the land. Neither mentioned this shift, but both felt it, a current pulling them toward something inevitable. The autumn cattle auction brought ranchers from all over the territory to town. Grace, who had a small herd to sell, found herself overwhelmed by the predominantly male crowd. She was considering postponing her business when Garrett appeared at her side, his steady presence a buffer against the curious stares and occasional crude remarks. "Didn't expect to see you here," he said, taking the reins of her wagon. "A few steers to sell," she explained. "But it's more intimidating than I anticipated." "I'll help," he said simply. And he did, negotiating prices that were fair, ensuring she wasn't taken advantage of because of her gender. By day's end, she had sold her cattle for a better price than she'd hoped, and found herself with enough funds to see the ranch through winter with some extra besides. "Let me thank you," she said as they walked toward the hotel, where a celebratory dinner was being held for the auction participants. "Join me for dinner." For once, they were equals in town, not visitor and host as they were at her ranch. The dining room was crowded with ranchers, merchants, and a few respectable ladies. At a small table in the corner, they shared a meal finer than either usually enjoyed. Garrett helped her onto the wagon seat, but didn't immediately release her hand. "Grace, he stopped, seeming to struggle with words. "Yes." Instead of speaking, he raised her hand to his lips, pressing a kiss to her knuckles. The gesture, so gentle and unexpected, made her breath catch. "Good night, Grace," he said softly, releasing her hand. She drove home in a daze, her hand still tingling where his lips had touched. The first snow came early that year, dusting the prairie in white overnight. Grace woke to a transformed world and the sound of chopping wood. Grace watched him for a moment, then went inside to prepare coffee and breakfast, knowing he must have ridden over at dawn to be here so early. By the time he finished, she had a hearty meal waiting. They ate in comfortable silence, the only sounds the clink of cutlery and the occasional crack from the stove. When he'd cleaned his plate, Garrett sat back, cradling his coffee cup. "Grace," he began, his voice serious. "With winter coming on, I was thinking." She waited, heart suddenly racing. "It would make sense for us to check on each other regularly. In case of trouble." It wasn't what she'd been hoping to hear, but she nodded. That seems sensible. I could ride over every few days. Or more often if the weather's bad. I'd like that. His eyes met hers across the table, and again she had the sense of something unspoken hovering between them. But the moment passed, and soon he was riding away, promising to return in 3 days' time. The winter storm arrived that night, howling around the eaves of the house. Grace lay awake, thinking of Garrett in his solitary cabin, wondering if he was warm enough, if he was thinking of her too. True to his word, Garrett returned 3 days later, forcing his way through deep snowdrifts. This pattern continued as winter settled over the land every 3 days. Regardless of weather, he would appear at her door, sometimes bearing small gifts, coffee, sugar, a book he thought she might enjoy. They passed the short winter days in domestic harmony. Garrett repaired things around the ranch, while Grace cooked and sewed. In the evenings, they would sit by the fire, sometimes reading aloud to each other, sometimes just talking. It was a comfortable routine, almost like a marriage, except for the careful distance they maintained, the way Garrett always left before darkness fell completely. Christmas approached, and Grace found herself planning a special dinner, wanting to create a memorable holiday for both of them. On December 23rd, Garrett arrived with a small fir tree tied to his saddle. "Thought you might like to decorate it," he said gruffly. Rebecca always said a house needs a tree at Christmas. Together they set up the tree in the corner of Grace's small parlor. She brought out the few ornaments she had saved from her parents' Christmases: delicate glass balls, a star for the top, paper chains she had made as a child. "It's perfect," she declared when they finished. Garrett stood behind her, looking at their handiwork. "It's been a long time since I celebrated Christmas properly," he admitted. After Rebecca. It didn't seem important. Grace turned to face him, suddenly very aware of how close they were standing. And now, his eyes, so often guarded, were open and vulnerable. "Now I find myself looking forward to it." The moment stretched between them, taut with possibility. But as always, Garrett stepped back first, breaking the spell. "I should go. It'll be dark soon." "Stay," Grace said impulsively. "For dinner at least." He hesitated, then nodded. "All right." That evening, they sat closer than usual by the fire, the glow of the Christmas tree casting a magical light over the room. When it came time for Garrett to leave, Grace walked him to the door. "I have something for you," she said, handing him a small package wrapped in brown paper and tied with string. "For Christmas. But you can open it now if you like." Garrett looked surprised, then touched. Carefully, he unwrapped the gift, a knitted scarf in deep blue wool. "You made this." Grace nodded, suddenly shy. "I noticed your old one was fraying. I thought. The color matches your eyes." He wrapped the scarf around his neck immediately. "No one's made me anything in years," he said softly. "Thank you." He reached into his coat pocket. "I have something for you too. Was going to bring it Christmas Day." It was a small wooden box, beautifully carved with a pattern of wildflowers. Inside, nestled on a piece of soft cloth, was a silver brooch shaped like a rose. "Garrett," she breathed. "It's exquisite." "It was my mother's," he explained. "One of the few things I have of hers. I want you to have it." The significance of the gift wasn't lost on Grace. This wasn't a trinket bought in town, it was a family heirloom, something precious and personal. "I'll treasure it," she promised, pinning it to her dress immediately. As he prepared to leave, they stood facing each other in the doorway, the moment heavy with things unsaid. Lewis. When Garrett arrived, he carried a small crate. "Merry Christmas," he said, handing it to her once inside. Grace opened it to find 6 jars of preserves: apple, peach, and blackberry. "Did you make these?" He nodded, looking pleased at her delight. "Last summer. Had a good crop of fruit." The day passed in a warm haze of good food, laughter, and an ease between them that felt new. As dusk approached, Grace noticed Garrett growing quieter, a familiar shadow returning to his eyes. "What is it?" she asked as they sat by the fire, the remains of their Christmas pudding forgotten. He was silent for a long moment. "I was just thinking. This is the first Christmas since Rebecca died that I've felt happy." He looked at her, a mixture of guilt and hope in his expression. "Is that wrong of me?" Grace's heart ached for him. "No," she said firmly. "It's not wrong to find happiness again, Garrett. Rebecca wouldn't want you to live in sorrow forever." "How can you be sure?" "Because she loved you." Grace reached out and took his hand. "And when you love someone, you want their happiness above all else." He didn't kiss her then, didn't declare his love. But something had shifted, a door had opened that couldn't be closed again. Winter deepened, isolating the scattered ranches even further. Garrett now stayed overnight during his visits, sleeping on a bedroll before the fire, unwilling to risk the dangerous ride home in darkness and frigid temperatures. These extended visits allowed them to grow even closer, learning the daily rhythms of each other's lives. One night in late January, a blizzard trapped Garrett at Grace's ranch for 3 days. "I'm not sure if that's a compliment," she teased. "It is." He grew serious, setting the carving aside. "Grace, there's something I need to say. These past months." The wind chose that moment to gust violently, sending a shower of sparks up the chimney. Garrett rose to check that the flue was secure, and the moment passed. When the storm finally broke and the trails became passable again, Garrett reluctantly prepared to return to his own ranch. "I need to check on my stock," he explained as he saddled his horse. "Make sure everything's still standing." He shifted in his chair, uncharacteristically fidgety. "I don't want to build it just for myself anymore." Grace set down her knitting, giving him her full attention. "What are you saying, Garrett?" He met her eyes then, his own filled with a mixture of hope and fear. "I'm saying I love you, Grace Keller.
Have for months now.
And if you could see your way to loving me back, I'd like to build that cabin for both of us." Joy bubbled up inside her, so intense it was almost painful. "Are you asking me to marry you?" "Doing a poor job of it, but yes." He moved from his chair to kneel before her, taking both her hands in his. "I know I'm not much of a catch-a-widower with too many sad memories and not enough to offer a woman like you. But if you'll have me, I promise to spend every day trying to make you happy." Tears filled Grace's eyes. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I'll marry you." Garrett's face transformed with joy. He rose, pulling her to her feet and into his arms. When his lips finally met hers, it was a kiss worth waiting for, tender at first, then deepening with all the emotion they'd held back for months. The ceremony was small, just the minister, Hank, and a few friends from town, but filled with joy. Grace wore a simple white dress she'd sewn herself, with Rebecca's silver rose pinned over her heart. After the ceremony, they drove to Garrett's ranch, now their ranch, where he had indeed expanded the cabin, adding a proper kitchen and a second bedroom for the future, as he said with a meaningful look that made Grace blush. That night, as husband and wife, they learned each other in new ways, their bodies expressing what words sometimes couldn't. Afterward, as Grace lay in his arms, she felt a completeness she hadn't known was missing from her life. "Happy?" Garrett murmured against her hair. "Perfectly," she assured him. The seasons turned, and their life together settled into a rhythm of work and love. They combined their herds and lands, creating a ranch that prospered under their joint care. When the school was finally built in town, Grace took a position teaching 3 days a week, fulfilling her long-held dream. Garrett continued to build furniture in his spare time, his creations growing more elaborate and sought after by folks in town. The cabin expanded again to include a workshop where he spent winter evenings crafting pieces that bore his distinctive style. A year after their wedding, as summer heat shimmered over the land, Grace shared news that brought tears to Garrett's eyes. She was expecting their first child. He held her as if she were made of glass, whispering prayers of gratitude against her hair. "Are you scared?" she asked that night as they lay in bed, his hand resting protectively over her still flat stomach. Terrified, he admitted, but hopeful too. We'll face it together. As Grace's pregnancy progressed, she noticed Garrett growing quiet at times, worry etching lines around his eyes. She understood his fear that history might repeat itself, that he might lose her as he had lost Rebecca. One afternoon in late autumn, Grace returned from teaching to find the house empty. Concerned, she checked the barn and workshop with no sign of Garrett. Finally, she walked to the small ridge behind their cabin where a single oak tree stood. It was a spot Garrett sometimes went to think, to be alone with his memories. As she approached, she saw him kneeling on the ground, his back to her. It wasn't until she was closer that she realized what he was doing. He was at Rebecca's grave, which he had moved from its original location when they expanded the cabin. And in his hands was a blue dress, the same one she had found him crying over the night they met. "I thought I'd forgotten how," he was saying softly, unaware of Grace's presence. "How to cry for you, how to miss you without breaking. But now, with Grace carrying our child, I'm remembering everything. The fear, the hope." His fingers caressed the faded fabric. "I still love you, Becca. Always will. But I've found room in my heart for her too. For our baby." His shoulders shook slightly. "Watch over them, will you? Keep them safe." Grace's heart ached with love for this man who carried his past with such grace, who had opened his wounded heart to love again. She stepped forward, intentionally making noise so as not to startle him. Garrett turned, hastily wiping his eyes when he saw her. "Grace, I didn't hear you coming." She moved to his side, easing herself down beside him despite her growing belly. "It's all right," she said gently, touching the dress. "You don't have to hide this from me." He looked at her with wonder. "Most women wouldn't understand." "I'm not most women," she reminded him with a small smile. "And Rebecca is part of who you are, part of what made you the man I love. I would never ask you to forget her." Garrett carefully folded the dress, his movements reverent. "I was so afraid to love you," he confessed. "Afraid I was betraying her memory. Afraid of losing you too." Grace took his hand, placing it on her rounded stomach, where their child kicked vigorously. "We can't live in fear, Garrett. Only in love." He nodded, a smile breaking through his tears. "You're right, as usual." He bent to press a kiss to her belly, then to her lips. "Let's go home." As they walked back to their cabin, hand in hand, Grace looked at the man beside her, no longer the broken soul she'd found crying over a dress, but a man rebuilt by love, stronger at the mended places. They had found each other in grief, and built something beautiful from the broken pieces of their hearts. 3 months later, on a cold winter night, Grace gave birth to a healthy daughter they named Hope. As Garrett cradled his newborn child, his face alight with wonder, Grace knew their story was just beginning. There would be more children, more challenges, more joy and sorrow as the years passed. But they would face it all together, bound by a love that had been strong enough to heal them both. In the corner of their bedroom stood a trunk, carefully preserved. Inside was a faded blue calico dress, a tangible reminder of the past that had led them to their present happiness. Neither forgotten nor dwelling in constant remembrance, but honored as part of the complex tapestry that made up their lives. And on the darkest nights, when the wind howled across the Montana prairie, Grace would sometimes find Garrett standing at the window, looking out at the distant ridge where Rebecca rested. She would slip her hand into his, a silent reminder that it was possible to carry the past with grace while still embracing the future with an open heart. As the seasons turned and their family grew, their love remained the constant that sustained them through every joy and challenge of their shared life on the frontier. And sometimes, on quiet evenings when the children were asleep, Garrett would take Grace's hand and lead her to the porch, where they would sit in the rocking chair he had made her so long ago, watching the stars appear over the land that had brought them together, two wounded souls who had found in each other not just healing, but a love worth living for.